At NVISO, we have a managed detect and response service where we provide a managed SOC for multiple customers. And there from the beginning, we actually had an automate first principle where we try to automate as much as possible all of the repetitive tasks that a SOC analyst does in its daily job. We also use XSOAR as a single pane of glass platform, which allows the analysts to collect all of the alerts from all of the different platforms we support. We support multiple SIEM platforms, EDR platforms, NDR platforms. And the analyst can see all of the alerts coming from all of those different platforms in one single pane of glass interface. And they can do all of their analysis from XSOAR. This allows the analyst to actually focus on analyzing meaningful alerts and actually, well, makes their job much more interesting. They don't need to take care of creating tickets in ITSM tools, doing visualizing all of the incidents in one same way. No, that's all done by the SOAR platform. The content in this webinar series is actually based on a blog post series we have started on the NVISO blog. So if you go to blog.nviso.eu, you can find the Cortex XDR tips and tricks series. So all of the content presented in these webinars will also be available on there. So if at any time you lose track, you cannot follow, you want to review something, go to the blog and you can actually see a detailed description of what we will cover in these webinar series. And while you're there, also check out the other blogs because there is some very interesting content on there. Before we get started, I'll do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Wouter Stinkes. I've been working at NVISO for almost 4 years now, which is quite a long time. Before I was at NVISO, I was a DevOps engineer. So automating stuff, well, that's always been part of my job. It's a bit corny to say, but it is my passion. I really love automating any task using scripting languages. When I started at NVISO, I was in the cloud security team. But as soon as NVISO started with implementing a SOAR platform, I jumped on the opportunity and I've only had fun since. So let's get started with the interesting part. The topic of today is XSOAR automations. What are automations? Automations are basically the way that you can run your custom code in the XSOAR platform. To automate workflows, there basically are 3 concepts you need to know. First of all, are playbooks, which is a visual representation of your automation flow. In those playbooks, you can either use, you can use tasks, and tasks can be either automations, what we will cover today, or commands from integrations. And integrations are basically the way that from XSOAR you interact with third-party platforms. So basically anything which has an API, you can interact with through an integration. But today we'll cover automations. At NVISO, we are currently on our 3rd generation of our playbook stack, of our automation stack. In the 1st and the 2nd generation, we only used playbooks, which meant that we had more than 200 playbooks, which actually are used in our entire flow. In the latest generation, we focus mainly on automations. We do everything within Python code. Automations can be written in Python, PowerShell, or JavaScript. But I honestly don't know why you would write an automation in JavaScript, so we do everything in Python. And what we have moved all of our logic to automations. Why? Mainly because of scalability. The performance of an automation is much, much better than the performance of a lot of playbooks together. We've actually been able to increase the performance by 200%. That's correct, 200%, by moving all of our logic from a playbook to an automation. So our goal is actually now to only keep 8 top-level playbooks where we define the flow, and all of the logic, all of the other logic we do is basically done within an automation. Does this mean that you should do this? Well, that's up to you. If you want to use automations as much as possible, well, this is basically software development. First of all, you need to have the right people with the right Python skills in your organization. And what we have done is we've implemented some of the principles I've learned as a DevOps engineer into our development workflow. Things like test-driven development, build pipelines. We automatically deploy our code using build pipelines. We've implemented the Scrum methodology to structure our development efforts. So those are the things that do come with moving more to automation and writing more code. You need to make sure that your code always works, and that's an important part. So it's up to you to decide how you implement all of your playbooks, but we use automations. The structure of this, well, what we'll do in this webinar is we're not going to bore you with a presentation. No, I'm just going to share my screen, show you the XSOAR platform, and let's start doing some stuff together. Let's find my right screen. So this is XSOAR. If you've never seen it before, this is how the interface looks like. And what we'll do first is we'll start with executing commands in an automation. As I said, a command is something that's either other automations you call, built-in automations, or commands from integrations. If you open the playground, here you can basically execute any command you want. If you use the exclamation mark, you can see all of the commands that are available. But before we get started, let's create an incident. An incident is basically an alert which gets pulled from a platform, a SIEM, EDR, NDR platform, into XSOAR. Just create one manually. And the first thing we're going to try is search for that incident. So there is a search incidents command, and give the ID that ID of 4. So this is a command you can run on the playground. So how would you actually run this command in an automation? Well, let's show you that. Let's create an automation. Let's say incident. And the way you execute commands in an automation is using the NVISO class and the execute command function method. The class is actually a class that's available in XSOAR out of the box. If you go to the documentation of XSOAR, you can see everything which is available on there. And this is already a large part of reusable code you can use in your automations. We are going to use the execute command method of this class to execute a command. That's what it's in the name. So the command we're going to run is, copy paste this. It's much easier. So we're going to search. Oh no. We're going to search for the incident with the ID 4. Okay. Let me open a new window. That will be easier. And let's run this command. Okay. So we ran the command and found the incident. What else are we doing in this automation is we're using the return results function. The return results is basically a way to return the output of this command towards the playground or the war room. So the way you visualize actually the output of that incident. This return result is available in the common server Python automation, which is basically it's almost more than 10,000 lines of code already created by Palo Alto, which you can reuse in your own automation. So again, check out the documentation if you want to know what is all available in there. And we are going to use the return results. And that's actually what returns the result to the as an output. So what's interesting to know is what's actually in that result. So let's look at that. Let's dump the JSON to the result of that command to the war room or to the playground. We don't need the result. We just are actually interested in, okay, what is the data structure returned by the execute command function? Okay, a lot of data is returned. Let's open it in a new tab that we can actually see what's in there. And here you can see what is actually returned by the execute command function. And this is a structure you will always see when executing commands in XSOAR. You always get back a list. That list always get back a list of dictionaries. And that dictionary will always have a type and the content. The content is actually what's returned or what you're interested in. So if you see here, okay, we have the content, we have the data, and actually the dictionary in the data list, this is the data representation of the incident. Here you can see the ID of the incident, all of it's built-in fields, so basically everything which you can see in the context data. Let me open this. Here you have the context data, which is actually a way to see, okay, what values does my field have from the interface? But when you're creating automations, this is the stuff you will use in your next steps in your automation. So this is very interesting. But actually what we're only interested in is the incident field. All of everything else which is around there, we don't really care about. So how would we do this? Basically, this is a Python data structure. It's a list with dictionaries. So let's only get the incident from there. So what we do here is, okay, we create the incident variable. We get the first element of the list, then we get the content key of that dictionary. The content key is also a list, so we get the first value of that list. So if we execute this, okay, so I already know that's already the next thing I wanted to mention. So I've used the wrong ID of the incident, which means that all of this expected data isn't there. So let's. And here you can see that the only data that's returned are actually the fields of the incident. So this is actually the data representation of the incident. It contains the custom fields that are defined, that contains the created date, who created it, actually everything you want to know from your incident is in there. But as I said, as you should seen before, what if we use the wrong ID? The result returned is not the same, so this will actually fail. A way to fix this is actually by ensuring that the data returned always has the correct values. And this is very important when creating automations. You want to create robust, your code needs to be robust. You also need to take into account what if my command doesn't execute correctly. Is my code still going to work if the result is different than I expect? And that's the reason why you should always do type checking. First I see, okay, if result, which means does my result have any content? Is it a list? Okay, if there is something, if result is a list and something is in there, then I can go to the next step. I can get the content field, which we can see here, and so on and so on. And eventually, I know that in the data, that the incident is in the first element of my data list. So let's execute this. The ID does not exist, so it's the wrong one. See, what's outputted here, your automation will not go into error. So that's already a very important tip when using automations. Make sure that your code is robust. If, like us, you put all of your logic into Python code, well, you don't want your scripts to crash when the result that is returned is not the expected result. So that's already a very important one. Next, we'll show you how to handle errors in automations. So let's go into not the playground, let's go into the incident. For the rest of the webinar, as a demo, we're going to show you how to add evidences to the evidence board. The evidence board is a place where the analyst can store anything basically related to the incident. So this is a central place where they can store all of the evidences that will support the conclusion of the analysis of the incident. Let's create an automation that actually does something. Well, actually, it doesn't do anything. It just it's just an automation to show you the demo. What this does is basically it outputs this result to the war room, to the incident. Let's try to run this. So in real life, this automation would, for example, contact the EDR platform, use the integration which is configured and all of the commands available to actually get the status of all of the artifacts of a certain attack, of a certain incident. But just for demo purposes, we're going to do it like this. What do we use in here? Another interesting one is to mention is the command results. This is again something in the common server Python. It's a class created by Palo Alto that you can use to actually format the output of your script so that you have a pretty output basically in the war room in XSOAR itself. So what you can define here is the title of the output and all of the results. The results can be a list or a dictionary, a list of dictionaries or a dictionary. And then again, we use the return results function to output this command result, and this is what is returned. So if we want to use this, add this output, for example, to the evidence board, well, from the interface, what you can basically do is here mark as evidence, and then it gets added to the evidence board. But we're talking about automations. We want to know how to do this in an automation. You have the built-in command, which is called add evidence. It takes the entry ID as a parameter, and the entry ID is basically every output to the war room has an ID. So if you click here you will see the entry ID. So it gets automatically added here. Let's add this to the evidence board, and here you can see, well, okay, the pretty output of my get malware status command is actually added to the evidence board. In real life, this could be interesting. That the analyst, if the analyst concludes, okay, all artifacts have been mitigated for this specific incident, they can you can add the status of those artifacts to the evidence board. So that is probably very interesting for the analysts. But what if we want to do this, the command we just executed in an automation? Let's create again a new automation. Evidence. Oh no, that already exists. Malware evidence. Again, we use the NVISO execute command function, and we add the entry ID. Let's execute this automation. And again, you can see the evidence has been added to the evidence board. Okay, cool stuff. But what if we, for example, not give the right entry ID? Let's just put a random value in there. And let's run this run this automation again. Okay, you would expect if you do this using the just using the add evidence in the war room, just give it a random value, you get an error. But if you do this in an automation, it doesn't return an error. Okay, that's strange. Why is this? If we do the we put the output of this command into a result. Let's save this one again and run it. You'll see again what we've shown previously, the output of the execute command. But here you can see the type is 4. And this means in XSOAR that actually your command has returned an error. And here in the contents, you can actually see the error. This is because if you go and see in the common server Python, I think it's here your entry types, which are your war room entry types. You can actually see what each of those entry IDs mean. First is a node. So this is if something runs correctly, it's returned with an entry ID of 1. And if it's an error, it's an entry ID of 4. And if you run commands in an automation, but it's important to know that something returns an error. For this, we have created actually a wrapper function that you guys can use. It's on our GitHub page. So if you go to NVISO Security GitHub organization and blog posts, in the Cortex XSOAR folder, you can find the Nitro execute command function. And this is a function, well, no, let me go back. And in this function, we actually check if the return type is 4. If the return type is 4, we raise an error. We also added some additional capabilities. We added retry logic. What we have seen, well, to improve the stability of our automations, we try a command 3 times before it returns an error. We've seen that, well, in the past, that sometimes a command fails for no reason at all, or we don't really know. So we always try three times, and then we raise the error. If it then still fails, well, you know it really fails. And we also added a fail on error. If we set this to false, even if the command fails, it will not raise an error, which sometimes, well, there might be a use case to do this. Sometimes you're not really sure, or it's a non-terminating error, and you don't really want to stop your automations when this fails. Then you could use this. So let's copy paste this one into our automation. We're not going to copy paste it into our automation itself, but we are going to copy paste it in the common server user Python. And this is actually an automation which can be used to put your reusable code. This gets added to all Python automations and integrations. So this is the perfect place to add your reusable code. You don't want to add this function to every automation you'll create. If you have the same strategy as us, as putting as much logic as possible in an automation, in automations, well, you will have a very long list. I think in our environment, common server user Python is probably between 10 and 20 lines of 1,000 lines of code. So that's a lot of code. You don't want to add that to each and every automation. So we save this. An important one to know is also that if you use the common server user Python with custom code, you need to set one specific server key, server configuration key. So if you go to the documentation of common server user Python, you can find this key. And this key prevents the code in common server user Python to be added to built-in automations or integrations. Why would you do this? At NVISO, we use a Python 3.10 syntax. We standardize on the latest version of Python, but there are still automations available on Cortex XSOAR, which are written in Python 3.7 or even Python 2, which honestly, I do not understand that a security product still uses an unsupported Python version, but that's still the case. And if you wouldn't configure this, you would get syntax errors on those Python 2 automations. So let's add this one. Okay, the configuration is added. Now let's use our Nitro execute command function instead of the misto.execute command. Okay, we're using the wrong entry ID. Let's save this and let's run it again. Now you do get an error when the function actually of the command returns an error. So here you can actually see, okay, error when executing command, add evidence with these arguments, and this is the error you get. So this is actually very interesting to use in your own environment. So it's available on the GitHub. And well, if you write automations, want to use automations, this is definitely the first thing you should do because you want to know if your commands actually throw an error. Okay, so now you know how to use execute commands in your automation. The next step will be, we're going back to the adding evidences to the evidence board. In our automation of the add evidence, add malware evidence, we actually need to, in this one, we need to hard code the entry ID of the entry in the war room. But if you run this automation in your playbook, you do not know what the entry ID is. Also, a good thing to know is entries in the war room are only created at the end of when your automation executes. So you basically cannot get the entry ID while the automation is executing. So for this, we'll use tags. If you see, we run this again. What you can do here is you can add tags. Evidence tag to make sure that we to say we want to add this to the evidence board. Maybe already clean up the evidence board a bit. So okay, now we have an entry in the war room that has this tag. Let's data automation, add malware evidence. What are we going to do? We're going to use the command get entries. This is maybe also an interesting one. How do we know that this exists? You have the script helper when you create automations. This actually lists all of the available commands, things, built-in scripts that you can use in your automation. So it's actually the documentation of what you can use. So let's say we search for entries. Okay, cool. We have the get entries one. What you can do here is you can copy this into your script, and here you can see, okay, we use the get entries command where we can get all of the entries with a filter, and we say, okay, we need the everything with the tag evidence. Let's delete this print statement. What we'll do is all of the results will get the entry IDs, and then we'll loop over all of those entry IDs and add the evidence. Let's run the add evidence again. And what you can see now, okay, we've added it to the war room. Okay, good to know. Let's see. But what we did now is we added the tag manually. Well, we actually also want to do this from an automation. So how would you do that? It's basically an undocumented feature. If you want, we have written a blog post about this, so you can revisit this afterwards. What you can basically do is in the command results, you can add the tags key to it manually. If you use the return results function, this does not happen, but we again have created a custom function which does this. So if you go to our NVISO GitHub repo, and we have created a nitro return tag command results. And what we do here is basically, as I said, we take the command results as an input, and we add just the tags that are given. So first, again, what we'll do is we'll add this to the common server user Python to make it reusable. Add this in here. And then let's use this one, copy paste this. And let's replace the get malware status, the return results, with the nitro return tag command results. And again, let's run this automation. And what we can see here, the tag has been added. Okay, cool stuff. And now we can use the, let's remove this one to keep it a bit clean. We use this, the add malware evidences, which we've created before. You can see again, something has been added to the evidence board. Okay, cool stuff. So now we know how to add evidences based on tags. So this is something you can do within your own environment. How would you do this in a playbook? Let's see, I already created the playbook for this. Okay, let's get that. Now, first we get the malware status, and then we add the malware evidence. The reason why we do this in two separate steps is again because I said an automation only outputs something to the war room at the end when the automation has been completed. So we need to do this because we cannot add the evidence without an entry ID. Or can we? Maybe we'll see that later in this webinar. So let's save this, save the playbook. Go back to our incident. Let's execute this playbook on the incident. Okay, so we completed. Again, see we can see that the playbook has added these evidence boards. But what you can also see is that we actually have a lot of duplicates, which can make it very confusing for the analyst to know, okay, what is actually the latest version and what is the correct one? So now I'm going to show you how to first how to use the replace functionality of adding evidences to the evidence board. First thing we need to do is, okay, let's see if that functionality is available. Actually, the only thing which is available is the mark as evidence. If we see here, let's see if something else is available. Well, the only thing that's available is add evidence and mark as evidence. So how would we actually do this? We will do this by using the API. XSOAR also has a built-in API you can consume from your automations. If you want to see the documentation of that API, you can, let's create a new window. You can go to Settings, Integrations, API Keys, and here you can actually view the XSOAR API, download it as a PDF, or use the Swagger file. What I usually do is I spin up a Swagger client, which then interacts with the XSOAR server. It's a bit of out of scope of this webinar, but that's actually very interesting to do because you can, from your Swagger client, you can actually execute all of the API commands, all of the required data structures are in there. It does authentication, so that's a very interesting thing to use. So let's open the XSOAR the API documentation on the server itself. So okay, here we can already see some stuff that's related to evidence. So you do have a search evidence API endpoint and a delete evidence API endpoint. But if we want to implement the replace functionality, these are the two one. If we want to implement the replace functionality for evidences, these are the two endpoints we will use. First, we search for it, and then we delete it, and then we add it again. So these are the ones that we will be using. But how do you use the XSOAR API in an automation? You basically have two options. The first option is in the NVISO class. You have the internal HTTP request command method. And this actually, without any authentication, you can do internal HTTP requests towards XSOAR itself. It's actually very interesting. The only problem with this is if you run it within a playbook, it runs with a read-only permissions. So that's what you can see here. If you run it in the war room, it runs with the permissions that whoever executes the script, the automation. But if you do this in a playbook, it has read-only. So sometimes you do want to do write actions towards XSOAR. So what would you do there? For that, you would use the NVISO REST API integration. In the NVISO REST API integration, you have all of these commands available. This is things that you can run by using the nitro execute command function, or from the war room, or from the playground. But the one you will mostly use is probably the API post, because for GETs, you should use the internal HTTP request method from the NVISO class. Why? Because this is much faster. If you can compare the performance of both, probably because there is no integration in between, there is no authentication required, the internal HTTP request method is much faster. So for anything which doesn't require write permissions, I would suggest you actually use those. Use that functionality, use that method. So before we can configure that integration, we need to get an API key. So you generate an API key, you copy it. This will only be available once, so you need to copy it before you close the window. We add an instance. We put the API key in here. We check trust any certificate because my server doesn't have a trusted certificate, and voila, it works. So how would we now use these two commands basically to first search for evidences and then delete them? I prepared again some functions for these ones. It's these two. First, I need to mention something else. To use the internal HTTP request method, we actually created again a function, a wrapper function for you to use. It's available on our blog, on our NVISO GitHub. And what does this do? If you execute this, and because it's an HTTP request, it doesn't throw an error if something is returned. You just get the HTTP response body back from that. So you will have to look at the status code. If actually, if the status code is not 200, it means it's not successfully executed, and it will raise an error. So again, let's copy paste this, add this to the common server user Python. Let's add it here. Okay. So I also already created a function which gets the incident evidences. We define the API endpoint to use. We define the body to use. So we need the incident ID. That's what you need to pass at the minimum as the body of a request to the API endpoint, to this API endpoint. And we can also define a query. The query that we're going to the query that the query we're going to do is passed as an argument here, so I'll show it you in the other automation. And then we use the execute HTTP request command, the one I showed you before, to execute this request towards the Misto API using the internal HTTP request method of the Misto class. Can sometimes get a bit complicated. Next, we have created a delete incident evidence function, which uses, because this is write permissions you actually need to use the Misto API post command from the Misto REST API integration. For this, we don't need a wrapper function. This is just a standard command. So with this, we can execute using the nitro execute command function. Let's save it, and then let's edit this one. So what do we do here? First, we define the description of the evidence. We get the incident ID. Then we define the query. So we're going to look for all of the evidences with the same description, and then we're going to get them. And for everything which is returned, that's what we're going to delete. And then again, we're going to use the tags. We're going to search for entries in the war room with the evidence tag, and then re-add that. So, okay, let's try this again. And now let's open the evidence board. Okay, we can see two evidences. They have been created now. The reason we have two is because there are two entries that are tagged with the evidence tag, but all of the other ones have been deleted. So, for example, if we just delete one of these tags and rerun it again, you will see you will only have one entry in the evidence board. Voila. And this is how you use the API for this specific example to avoid duplicates in your evidence board. But if you go to the API documentation, there is much more you can do. Something you can do that's very interesting is you can also execute commands through the API. Why would you do this? I've said before that an entry in the war room is only created when you it's only created after the automation has completed. So let's say we want to do everything within one automation. Our principle is to use as little as playbooks as possible. But I just shown you to do this in an automated workflow for an incident. You will need to have 2 steps in your playbook. But what if we want to do this in one automation? For this, you can use the API. We'll use the API to execute the get malware status command. That will return the entry ID in the same automation, and then we can use that entry ID to add it to the evidence board. So let's see which API endpoint we can use for this. If you go to the documentation, it's not really clear what you can use for this, because it's actually create new entry in existing investigation. You will find duplicates. It's the entry endpoint and the entry execute sync endpoint. It's not clear from the description, but you can use this to execute commands through the API. Why are there 2? This one executes command but doesn't wait for the result. If you use this endpoint, it will execute command, wait for the result, and return that result to your automation. And this is actually what you want. You want to execute commands and do something with the returned result. As in our example for the evidences, we want to get the entry ID back and use that to add the evidences. So again, we have created a wrapper function for this. It's called Nitro Execute API command. It's available on a GitHub if you want to use it. And what we do here is, okay, we pass it the command and argument as a dictionary. But this command actually needs to be in the format that you would do it here in this in the war room. So it needs to have exclamation point and then add and let's do it here. And all of the arguments need to be in this format. So this is not a dictionary. So what do is we transform this into the right format. And then we use the NVISO API post command with this API endpoint, and we put the body, the data. That is what needs to be the command. You need to give it the investigation ID, which is the incident ID. And this is how you can actually execute commands through the API. So let's create a new automation to do everything in one automation. We created it. I'll walk you through what we do here. No, this is not the correct one. This is the correct one. Well, okay, first, again, because we don't want duplicates, we get the incident evidences from the API, we delete them, and then we execute the get malware status automation. From the returned result, we get the entry IDs, and then we loop over all of the entry IDs to add the evidence to the evidence. Let's first clean up that. Well, no, we shouldn't clean up the evidence board. Let's execute this command. I don't think we didn't add this to the command server user Python. Let's do that one. Now, you can see here that the entry is created because you execute the get malware status automation through the API, and the evidence has been added to the evidence board. So by using the API, you can execute commands or get the return status and do something with those in your automation. So you can actually do as much as possible within one automation. Okay, that's actually it. So okay, we're quite on time. Sebastian, maybe we can go to the Q&A now. If, as I said before, if something is not clear or you want to review something, please go to our NVISO blog. Here you can see the Cortex XSOAR tips and tricks series. Everything which we have covered today is actually in there, even some additional content which we couldn't cover because of time constraints. But if you have any questions about this, you're more than welcome to contact me on LinkedIn or post comments on the blog themselves. So maybe, Sebastian, are there any questions?
We had one question come in through the chat. Is it possible to import external library in automation? Benjamin already answered it kind of in the chat, but can you expand on it?
Yes, you can use all Python automations in your automations. But if it's not a built-in Python automation, it's important that that library, if it's not a built-in Python module, it's important that that module is imported into your Docker container. So you wouldn't need to basically fork the NVISO Docker containers. They all have custom Docker containers you should use, and you can use your own version. That's actually something that we do. All of our automations use our own custom Docker container because we do use some additional libraries that are not part of the standard Python modules. We use it for logging. But,
are there any questions, Al? Just open your microphone and speak up if you have any additional questions. Seems to be clear.
Okay, cool stuff.
So just one more point. Walter already mentioned it. Please follow our blog. Our social media handles are here. If you're not following already, please do. And I also copied a short questionnaire into the chat. It would really help us improving our webinars if you could just take a couple of minutes on answering these. And if there's no more questions, then I think that's it for today.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining and hope to see you in the next installment of the SOAR for Fun and Profit webinar.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.